When it comes to intimacy, do you have a lot of guilt and frustration that it's more complicated than you have the bandwidth for? Or do you feel discouraged and want to deepen your connection with your spouse, but you don't know how to navigate those desire gaps or those sensitivities and frustrations, and you feel like a failure? Or maybe it just feels easier to avoid when you can't make sense of those intimacy barriers. Well, you are not alone. And today we're going to address all of these things and more with our noteworthy guest and my mentor and hero, Dr. Jennifer Finlayson-Fife. So stay tuned. Hey parents, welcome to Fulfillment Therapy. Do you want to raise your kids better and have a stronger marriage? Are you up late at night researching marriage and parenting tools and self-care tips? Do you start each day hoping for deeper connections and less chaos, but it ends with family arguments and going 12 different directions again? My name's Kendra, wife, mom, therapist, and growth enthusiast. It wasn't until I discovered how to fulfill my unmet needs that I was finally able to show up as my best self as a spouse and parent. I realized that by meeting my needs, I could more fully meet the needs of my family with more energy and less resentment. In this podcast, I teach parents skills like boundary setting, prioritizing personal needs, communication, and claiming ownership. Just like my clients, you'll be shocked by the improvement in your marriage, parenting, and personal life when you focus on fulfilling your important unmet needs. Ready to prioritize yourself so you can quit mentally throat punching people? Then grab those earbuds and head outside, and let's walk and talk. Welcome back to Fulfillment Therapy. Today we have a special guest, Dr. Jennifer Finlayson-Fife. She's a relationship and sexuality expert with a PhD in counseling psychology. She's known for her work working with Latter-day Saint couples, and she tackles some really challenging topics like intimacy, especially. She does coaching and online courses and podcasts like Room for Two and also Conversations with Dr. Jennifer. So really excited that you're here. And I know everybody says this, but I'm also a big fan. So really excited to pick your brain a little bit about some of these topics. Thank you again for coming on the show.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Do you mind if I ask, and you probably get asked this a lot too, why the fascination with intimacy?
It's a good question. I think that a couple of reasons. When I was young, I always knew I wanted to work with marriages. And I thought, you know what, that's too scary. Because I was a kid and I thought, how am I going to really work with couples? But there was something about marriage that I thought it had a lot of promise in it, but I saw people being relatively unhappy. I think the other thing is that I felt like people would give sort of lip service to sex being a good thing in my kind of religious context. But then I would also get the sense that everybody was, well, a lot of my leaders were kind of freaked out by it or didn't really like it. Or I just kind of could see this duality. So when I was getting my PhD, I was actually asked to teach a couple of undergrad courses on human sexuality. And so that was at the same time I was looking for a dissertation topic. And these were mostly Catholic students because I was at Boston College. And so seeing through their essays and so on, a lot of these inner conflicts and turmoil around sexuality, it really kind of led me to think about what is LDS women's experience and how comfortable are women in the sexual realm when they're married and so on. And so that just led me into the topic, and then it took off, because there was a lot of need for it. And so, people started inviting me onto podcasts and all that to talk about my research and so on. So, yeah.
Do you ever get tired of it now that you've been doing it for so long?
Oh, no, never. No, never. It's the best. It's the best job. I love working with couples. I love helping people. I love helping people see what they just need help seeing what it is that's keeping them stuck, and then they can do it, so it's very rewarding work.
There's a time that I wanted to go into sex therapy specifically as well. And I think a lot of my friends think I'm obsessed with sex, but I just think it's so important to have these conversations that people don't really want to have. Haven't talked about a ton on the podcast, but I have wanted to more. So I'm really excited to launch into some questions, if you don't mind, if I ask your expertise on some difficult things.
Yeah.
I was going back and forth on what to talk about, and you approved one of the topics. And at first I wasn't very excited about it. But since then, I've had this change of heart, I guess you could say, and really excited to speak to something, especially when I see so many of my own clients struggle with the same topic. And we're kind of hitting a lot of different things. I want to talk about shame and about trauma. I know this is something you speak to in your podcast. My first question for you is that a lot of people might not realize how their past experiences affect their current sex life. And how can someone recognize if trauma is impacting their ability to connect sexually with their spouse?
So one thing I would just say, just kind of as kind of the beginning layer of this, is that as human beings, our eroticism is highly, highly impacted by meaning. That is, how much desire we have for sex is very much linked to the meaning that we attribute to sex. And, for example, dogs, they can't attribute meaning. So dogs can copulate, but they can't make love, right? And they also, can't worry, like, does my male partner really like me? Do they really love me? Or are they just in it for the sex? They're not thinking things like that. Okay.
Right.
Humans, we're always giving meaning to everything we do because we have a prefrontal cortex. And sexuality, we don't want to feel that being sexual is constricting our life. That is, we want to belong to our own sense of self. We want a sense of freedom when we're sexual. And so if meanings are making us feel less free, our sexual desire will go down. So that's just really important. So like when somebody is not wanting sex in marriage and they had some trauma early on, I can't remember how you put the question. Can you give me the question once more so I'm answering it in the right way?
We often don't realize how our past experiences affect us sexually in the present day. And how can we recognize if that is impacting our ability to connect sexually with our spouse?
Yeah, well, I don't know if we always necessarily know for sure that it is, right? Some people have come to me and said, I have no trauma that I can think of, and yet I feel like a sense of suffocation and anxiety when I'm being sexual. Other people that have had some traumatic experiences, but it doesn't seem to be impacting their desire. So I don't know if we can necessarily know for sure, but I think we can look at, are there meanings around my experience right now that are making me feel that I can't belong to myself, or making me feel a sense of being, of demand, or that I have to do something or produce something, or, that is, the sexual self doesn't want to be bullied or controlled. And so if there's a meaning that's happening within us, right, that is in that direction, our desire is probably going to plummet. Now, it could be about an old meaning that is now coming up inconveniently, right? Even though you're with somebody that, you're in your marriage and you're thinking, I know I'm safe with this person. I know that this is okay. But the old meaning is kind of there affecting you. Other times it could be that there are things going on in your marriage that maybe you're having a harder time addressing directly that are linking back to an old experience, right? And therefore they're coming up. So I don't know if we always know precisely where it's coming from, but what we can do often is, instead of get mad at ourselves and upset with ourselves that our desire is going down, is to kind of trust our sexual self a little bit and understand that it's trying to give us information, and that there's something there to understand rather than to judge. Our judgment against ourselves for not feeling desire will only make our desire go away more. And so if we can understand it and get curious about it and say, like, what is happening inside of me? What am I feeling? What do I think it's about? That's much more likely to help us address what's happening in a productive way than judging it, or even necessarily trying to pin down exactly where it's coming from.
I really appreciate how you said get curious, because I think that does take that judgment out of it. And instead you recognize that it's information. It's even like that tender nugget, like a good thing, like this bit of grace that can give you the help that you need to move forward step by step as you're ready.
Yep.
I love that. When we first decided on this topic, I'm like, that's not something that I'm like super passionate about right now. So I don't know. But then since then, I've talked on the podcast how I've had sexual trauma. It's things that I've worked through. I've done EMDR. I've had a lot of therapy. I feel great. I don't typically feel very activated or triggered by it. And then out of the blue, just not that long ago, last week maybe, super triggered. And I think about that with listeners, other people going through some of those things. Like, yeah, I've done my work. My husband and I are both therapists. So there's a lot of safety in my relationship. I've been married for about 20 years. And yet I always think of it like an onion. I've taken back all these different layers. I feel like I've got a pretty good handle on things. And then out of the blue, super triggered and unable to really find that clarity. And it feels super confusing. And my heart goes out to those listeners that don't have that background and feel like really confused about what to do with that when that shows up in intimacy.
Well, again, I think it's the same idea as like, we just owe ourselves a big dose of compassion, being human beings, being vulnerable as human beings in a world where there's a ton of uncertainty. And, sometimes you can just be going along and something happens and the meaning of it, you can't even quite understand it, but you can feel that you're regressing. You feel overwhelmed, you feel emotional, and you can't, I'm a therapist. I'm pretty good at like figuring out what I'm feeling, but there's certainly times where I'm like, I have no idea why I am having a hard time kind of just managing my emotions right now, or even figure out why I'm feeling as emotional as I am. And I just find that getting harsh with oneself is completely unhelpful. It's just like, you're alive and there's a lot going on, and sometimes you're tired and there's just reasons why you're regressing that you can't always keep track of. I think the more compassion and curiosity we can just bring to that, the higher the chances are that we're going to basically level up and stabilize a bit and learn a little bit about ourselves, right? And so it's just not being too harsh, and just, especially if you're partnered with somebody that knows that that's going to happen every once in a while and you can just be friends in that. I mean, that's the couple that's going to thrive, because life can be so unpredictable and, we're vulnerable human beings. And so the more compassion we have for ourselves, the better.
Absolutely. And luckily he responded very well. He gave me that space. We've kind of worked through some of the enmeshment from earlier in our relationship. Just listened to me when I was ready to talk, but didn't push me or force me. And you mentioned stuff like that. Like, we really need to feel like we're not going to be bullied or controlled, like you talked about. The more that I learned, the more I realized that I think a lot of my early marriage, and I want to ask you about this in a little while, about climaxing, that was super challenging for like 10 years. I don't think I ever did. I also think there's a lot of dissociation that was happening in intimacy. And I was wondering if you could speak to that at all.
Yeah. So, I have done quite a bit of studying on trauma, like since I got my PhD, just working with different specialists, but it's not really been the focus of my work. So I just want to give that caveat that I am not like, this is, the focus of what I do. So I'm just giving my understanding of it. But I think dissociation is, generally speaking, kind of the mind trying to protect itself. And so if something feels scary, regressive, fearful, we will tend to just disconnect from it as a way to sort of manage how much meaning we can handle. And so, again, that sexual self in a way is trying to protect you by like just kind of disconnecting you from it. And so again, if you can understand that you're doing it, understand that there's a meaning happening that's making it hard to be present. Of course, that doesn't make you defective. It's good judgment, especially if you've gone through something traumatic, to try to dissociate or disconnect. But of course, we are our happiest the more integrated we become, the more that we can sort of reclaim all of who we are, the more that our limbic understands that it doesn't have to work so hard. I mean, that's what I think good trauma therapy does, is release the limbic from its job a little bit and not have it be so overly helpful. But it's when you can integrate meanings where you get to belong to yourself, that you are clear that you're belonging to your sexuality is okay, that you are clear that you're going to take care of yourself if being sexual is not a good idea for you. Right. But again, that sexual self wants to feel free, not controlled, hemmed in, judged. And so if it's fearing any of those things, it's usually going to turn itself off.
I really appreciate you talking about that. And we did see a therapist in the beginning of our marriage, and he said something to me. If you can't be present, then you shouldn't be intimate. You can say no or something. And it gave me permission to let go of that guilt or that shame.
Yes.
And so I did start doing that more. And I think that's when I was able to stop dissociating. And at least for me, it looked more like feeling a little bit disconnected from my body, feeling like I'm spacing out more or daydreaming or my mind is wandering or like just not really doing what really intimacy is meant for, is to connect together. It was so hard to stay present. So as I was able to do that more and more, I think I've been able to stay present in.
Yeah. No, it's everything. And, kind of like what I'll say to people is don't go anywhere that you can't be together. Right. Yeah. And so even if, someone who's had a traumatic experience in their past, they'll often feel guilty or bad or confused that they are regressing, that they are dissociating. But that's just not going to help you. And trying to be where you can be together and where you can calm yourself, that's going to get you much further, if that's the way to say it. That's going to give you much more of what your soul needs than trying to push towards something where you think where you believe you should be as a couple. That won't ever work.
Oh, absolutely. A lot of us minimize our traumatic experiences. I see this constantly with my clients, and they think they're not bad enough to count. So I know trauma is complicated and it's hard to identify what it is, what it's not. But how does this affect intimacy, and how can we validate those experiences without comparing them?
Yeah, again, I just think the sexual self does not respond to judgment. If we sit there and start judging ourselves and telling ourselves we're having the wrong feelings or we don't deserve to have those feelings, it's just not going to help us. Again, I think if our sexual self doesn't trust us to be kind to it, it's not going to want to show up. And so if we're having a response, again, understanding it. That's always going to help you move forward. What is happening? Why is it happening? There is a sense to it. There are so many good reasons to not want to be sexual, right? There are so many good reasons, especially for women, and especially for women who've had trauma. So sitting around judging yourself for it is not going to get you anywhere. Understanding what's happening and how it might be related to what's actually happening in your relationship or something that you need to address the meaning of within yourself. Right? There's just information there that can help you get into a wiser position with yourself and potentially move forward in a better, more integrated way. But harshly shaming it or judging it is not going to help you get anywhere.
And so much easier said than done, right? It's so easy to go to shame.
It is.
I appreciate that reminder, though. And my next question was about listening to your podcast episode on trauma recently. So good. And for the first time, I felt like something clicked, like it made sense in a way that it didn't before listening to that. I really appreciated what you spoke to, and I don't even know if you remember it, but you said something about self-betrayal. And a lot of people experience this sense of self-betrayal when they don't honor their instinct for that self-preservation, that deep-rooted desire to escape during intimacy.
Yes.
Well, how can we navigate this and find that balance between healing and honoring those feelings?
Yeah. So I trained a lot with Dr. Schnarch, and one of the things he would always say is we want to belong to ourselves more than we want to be sexual. Now, women have learned a lot of messages, and women, so let me say this. I think biologically speaking, women as a group tend to be tuned into what other people desire more than men as a group. And it's a survival thing for babies. You can track when the baby's hungry. You can track when they are feeling distressed, and so that ability to map the mind of others is a gift. And it can also be a curse, especially if you've grown up in an environment where you were taught a lot that it's virtuous to basically put your own desires and feelings aside for the feelings and desires of others. And so when you've learned that that is a measure of Christ-like behavior or, a form of goodness, then we and then when we teach women that they aren't as sexual as men are, and that if you're really a good woman, you don't really deal with your desires and so on, we teach women that they should produce sex as a function of being a virtuous partner. So all those factors combined make it very, very easy to get into a bit of a production mindset around sex, that I should do this for my husband. He has needs. What is the matter with me? I used to feel desire when we were dating and now I don't. And what's wrong with me? And I should just, force myself through it. Well, what you're doing, and your sexual self doesn't like it, is you're participating. Of course, you come by it honestly, and it certainly is understandable how one can do this. You start bullying yourself. You start kind of basically saying what you think and feel isn't as important as managing how your husband feels, right? Mm-hmm. And so even though it's intuitive and you maybe even were taught to do that, it ends up working against desire. It ends up working against intimacy, like where you can both be together, and your desire will plummet because, again, the sexual self wants to be free, right? It does not want to be hemmed in, doesn't want to be bullied. And so the resentment tends to really go up, because even if your spouse wouldn't want you to be doing that, right? Even if you're married to a really good person who doesn't want you to be self-betraying, if you are doing it, you're still going to feel resentment, because whenever we prioritize a relationship over our own well-being, we will tend to feel resentful, and we will tend to undermine the relationship, even though we're ostensibly trying to preserve it.
So it's really whenever there's that piece of invalidation for yourself, then that desire goes way down. It makes sense that women really struggle with desire often, right?
Yeah, 100%. And in my dissertation research, it was just a small percentage of the women that I interviewed who really thrived around sexuality. But the thing that they consistently did was they took their desires and feelings seriously, both in and out of sex, right? In their lives in general, and in their marriages, and in sex. So they saw themselves as equal to their husbands. They didn't compromise themselves for their husband's comfort or feelings. They certainly loved their husbands. They were good to their husbands, but they weren't basically undermining themselves so that their husband wasn't mad at them. And so that made it so they could actually create something collaborative, something that was good for both of them. They were comfortable saying no, because, if no was the right answer one night, right, that wasn't, they couldn't be there, they couldn't be intimate, it opened them up to being able to say yes in other moments, because what was basically operating in that was this ability to be true to themselves while still valuing and working towards creating a solid relationship.
These are all such good nuggets. I'm writing down all these things that I love. I just love hearing somebody else talk about them, because they're really not, as you know, they're not talked about a lot. But it totally makes sense that, yes, desire would go up if it's a win-win, if you can see yourself as an equal, if you stand up for yourself. I don't remember how you said it. In and out of sex.
Yeah.
It sounds like this is all self-advocacy, but something that we are often learning as an adult, right?
Yes, that's right. And so often have been taught not to do it. And, just like, I don't know, a couple of weeks ago, I was upset with my husband, and I got into bed, he was kind of, initiating, and I just felt, anger. Now, I'm not saying that it was 100% rational or fair on my part, but I was kind of in this like retraction and resistance. And so he made a comment about it, and I kind of self-reflected, and I just said, I just feel it's upsetting to me when you do A, B, and C, and it just makes it really hard for me to, I want to be open. So I'm being true to myself and trying to name what is there. So that's important, because it's like beginning to like speak to, I wasn't trying to like excuse, like say like, this is why, you're bad and I'm good. But I was trying to just speak to my own experience in that moment. And, he said something like, he started to defend himself a little bit. And then he said, but you know what, you're right. You are right that I do that. And, I can see why that's frustrating for you. Well, immediately my desire went up. Immediately. Okay. Because
it's like
which
magic.
is so weird. Like 2 seconds I was like dead on arrival. And then suddenly I'm like, okay, actually I changed my mind. But for me, it was just like a small moment of like, I'm belonging to myself. I'm speaking honestly about something that's getting in my way. He's honestly addressing it. And that ability to belong to myself and be with him went up, and so did sexual desire. And that's just like a snapshot of a moment, but that's so much what collaborative, intimate relationships look like.
I can't help but notice too, it's not just about your desire goes up when there's self-validation, but here when he validated you, any sort of validation helps.
No, it's true. It's absolutely true. And because it was honest on his part, like he wasn't letting his ego win, I mean, it started to for a second and he said, but you know what, you're right. And so that's just like, it's not just, oh, I'm validating you. Yes, it was a validation, but it was based in an honest self-awareness. And so that's very desirable. It's not being coddled. It's about a collaborative conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. In all of your work that you've done, I'm sure that you've worked with a lot of trauma survivors that feel a lot of shame. We've mentioned that a little bit already, but especially for maybe complicating their spouse's sex life. And I say that like in quotes, like they have this deep-seated belief that they're complicating it. How can couples address that guilt and work towards more understanding and even creating more fulfillment in the bedroom?
Yeah. So I talked about this a bit on, I think, the podcast that you were referencing, which is just around the person who has come out of some traumatic experience really has a decision to make, because it's very easy to either resist or capitulate. And neither one of those is going to help a marriage, because when you capitulate and have sex that you don't really want to have, that sense of self-betrayal comes up. But when you resist, you may feel a little more like I'm behind the wall and I belong to myself, but I'm worried about, are we going to make it? Like, are we going to be okay as a couple? And so both of those are very normal responses, but they don't help you move forward. The thing that helps you move forward is if you decide for yourself that you want to address your sexuality and you want to create a better sexual relationship, even though you have some roadblocks in front of you around it, but you want that for yourself. You want that for your marriage. In my experience, remember, the sexual self wants to feel free. If you feel like you're doing it because your spouse wants you to do it, and your therapist wants you to do it, and you should do it, it's just, you're going to be in cross purposes and it's not going to work, right? Because the part of you that wants to be free, that's the part that's connected to your sexuality, is feeling bullied by the meanings that you're giving it. I have to do this. Yeah. And the truth is, you don't have to do it. You don't have to do it. You don't have to deal with your sexuality. You don't have to create an intimate marriage. So I've had conversations with clients like this, and then they say, but I do want to work on it. I'm like, well, let's do it. Yeah, but I don't want to work on it. I mean, it's not quite that succinct, but that's basically the struggle internally. Like, I do, but I don't. And that's kind of life, especially around the parts of ourselves where development is possible. We have some deep ambivalence because we know it means facing more of our fears. It might mean giving something up that we want, like the freedom to go behind a wall, maybe. But I think that you have to, on some level, choose to address your trauma with the goal of reclaiming your sexuality for yourself, right? Because a lot of times, again, it's good judgment to want to get away from sexuality if that is the space in which you were invaded, in which you were violated. And I think that the meaning of belonging more deeply to yourself, to your values, to your higher desires, that is about reclaiming your sense of agency again, your sense of freedom. Because I don't want that perpetrator to have any more psychological space. And so I'm reclaiming this for myself. That's connecting it to freedom again. Then when you're working with your spouse at whatever stage that is, because that may mean doing some work with yourself for a bit. When you're working with your spouse, you're never producing sexual engagement. You're calming down and finding a way to be together where you can both settle in. And it sounds sort of counterintuitive to people. Dr. Schnarch, who I trained with for quite a while, talked a lot about hugging till relaxed, doing these exercises that allow you to settle into your own skin and into your own body. When we're up judging and getting really harsh with ourselves, we're out of our minds. We're kind of out of our bodies. If we can kind of get curious and settle into our bodies, that's where the soul of sex is. That's where the soul of desire is. And if we can settle in, we can feel like we belong to ourselves and I can be here with my spouse. That's where people start to feel the resonance. And even with some couples, it was, I've worked with couples where I had them do this hugging exercise where they're just settling down. And I remember him coming back and saying, that's the closest I have ever felt to my wife, right? Because they were settling into their own body and into each other and able to really be with each other. They were never having that with sex, even though they were having intercourse, right? But because there was so much anxiety and resistance and fear, and this wasn't somebody who'd gone through trauma, but she just experienced sex as a demand. And so she would lose all desire, and then he would feel rejected. And then they were like, well, we probably just still should have sex because otherwise we're really screwed up. And so they'd kind of go through the motions of an intimate relationship, but never feel it. And when they stopped trying to produce an outcome and started settling down with one another, they started to find that place of connection that then they could work on expanding, and bringing more of themselves to that connection and more of their sexuality to that connection.
It sounds like elements of letting go, just to be able to relax, that sense of acceptance to really get further.
Yeah, that's
and yet,
right.
Yeah. And yet there's this part of me, I just think about my clients that have really struggled with this for a long time. I often see that, well, it's difficult, right? Facing trauma, there's so many layers, it takes forever. But then on the other side, I really feel for that spouse that there's not a lot of sex happening. There's not a lot of movement or momentum, sometimes not a lot of ownership, because there's that fine line of like not pushing or, being patient. How do you navigate that? I don't even know how to put that into a question, except for like, that's a challenge. Like, how do you have patience and also encourage that forward momentum?
Yeah, well, there's a difference between having patience and pretending there is forward momentum when there isn't, versus having patience with a real process, but in which there is real movement, right? It's one thing to say, I'm trying, when in fact I'm resisting, right? And again, I'm not even judging somebody who's doing that. It's just the more honest we can be with ourselves about what's actually happening, the better. Being patient when in fact you're both colluding in not addressing the elephant in the room, that's not going to get you anywhere. Yeah. If you're being patient with the fact that, to really move forward, it means moving, ostensibly backwards for a period of time, but you really are finding something deeper and richer together. And you really are creating a deeper sense of safety with each other. And you're getting clear about being able to belong to yourselves and each other. Well, that's patience with a really beautiful process that is going to be meaningful even for a husband. If the husband's only, thinking about, when are we going to have real sex? Okay, well, he's also not in a collaborative position with his female partner. So, I think, again, it's easier to say I'm trying than to maybe own I don't want to try. Right? I don't want to do this. And, I've also had clients who were very ambivalent about dealing with their sexuality and not really doing it, even though they were doing exercises and ostensibly trying. And where the husband has then said, you know what, I can see that this is just more than you want to deal with. And I'm going to release you of having to deal with it. We can raise the kids, finish raising the kids, but then probably I may eventually go. I just want to release you of the demand of trying to make this an intimate marriage when you don't want it to be. In, the case in my mind, it was very sincere. He wasn't saying it to manipulate. He wasn't trying to scare her. He was really just like, I just am uncomfortable trying to get you to want something you don't want. And that was the thing that shifted it for her, because again, her sense of freedom now went up, because she was always in this, like, I'm trying to produce something for my husband and I kind of resent it, even though I am trying. She was trying, but her sexual self was resisting. And so once she saw, like, he's really not going to pursue, she got much clearer. I want this. I want to have a close relationship. I don't want you to not want me. And it freed her up to try in a different way. And she'd never orgasmed. And then she orgasmed for the first time within a couple of weeks of that.
I love those positive stories. And especially in that scenario, the pressure was off. I can totally see how that would be.
Yeah.
a turn on, honestly, even though it
Yeah.
was a very terrible consequence, essentially, just feeling like you had a voice a little bit more, especially.
Yeah.
I don't know if she
Right.
had
It was clearer than ever then that she really had a choice. He wasn't mad. He wasn't punishing her. He like, I'll finish raising the kids. I'm not going anywhere. I'm not going to try to make you want something you don't want. I just like can't do it.
Right.
And so, and that was out of his own self-respect. And I think that's when she really knew she had a choice. And in that freedom, she's like, wait a minute, I want to deal with this. Mm-hmm.
That's a beautiful story. And it's complicated. Even with my husband and I don't even know how he's done it, except for he has learned it's gentle communication, I think, on both of our ends, like really trying to understand something so complex. It's hard to figure it out. But like I was just asking you about, like, how do you encourage that growth when everything in you wants to run from something that it's so easy to feel powerless, so easy to feel resentful or residing in that shame? And I love these simple things that you teach us to help us get out of that, like that curiosity, that compassion, recognize that we do have a voice and learning how to advocate for ourselves. That's not as easy as it sounds though, right? Like, do you have any other suggestions on how to start advocating for yourself if you're not accustomed to that?
It's a good question. And some people really focus their work on that, like how to help women with self-advocacy and so on. But, I think the way I tend to approach it is helping women better see the way that they have either learned to disregard their own feelings or the ways that they have at least gone along with that inside of themselves. And just starting to get more anchored into what do I desire? What do I feel? What is happening inside of me? Why am I resisting? Like there's a deep self-respect in even asking those questions and trying to figure them out. And, sometimes we're really focused on how do you say it to another person, which matters, of course. But a lot of times we got to sort it out within ourselves a bit and just create that space within us because we're teaching other people how to relate to us, how to treat us. And so how we treat ourselves and around our own feelings is a big deal. And so I'm very interested in people getting into a higher integrity relationship within themselves. What I mean by that is, listening to their feelings. I don't mean that feelings are everything, but they have a lot of information. And so you want to see what information is in there. Sometimes I've been irrationally mad about something or sad and it feels irrational. And I'm not saying it's rational, but there's something there to understand. And the more I can understand it, the more I can go and make a reasoned decision or communicate about something if it's needed. And so that is in the space in which you forge a self. And you need a self if you're going to have an intimate life. You need a self that can be in that conversation. And so the self-respect is definitely the birthplace. Then it's like holding on to yourself while you're in a conversation, which is the next stage and can be challenging because then you're tracking, oh, my husband thinks that's a stupid idea. Oh my gosh, like maybe it is a stupid idea. And then you can start to move into uncertainty again. And I don't mean that whatever you're thinking is the world's best idea, but can I still hold on to what I honestly think and feel, even in the face of invalidation? Well, it's a practiced muscle, especially if you've always tended to capitulate when you track invalidation. Learning to say what you honestly think and feel, even when other people have different perspectives, is the path of growth. So again, this isn't like, oh, these are broken women who have to learn how to communicate. This is a developmental path. Sometimes men have the reciprocal pathway that they have often been socialized or wired more to say whatever they think, but it's insensitive to other people. It's not accounting for other people's experience. So sometimes I'm of course stereotyping right now, but sometimes men have to learn the other thing, how to self-inhibit more, how to be more curious, how to understand other perspectives. Nothing helps us learn wherever we're weak better than marriage does, right? Because, our vulnerabilities will show up and cause us suffering. But yeah, so learning to do that. I mean, I think just respecting that as a developmental process that's going to be uncomfortable, that's going to be met with invalidation at times, but that's the way we get clearer and stronger and become capable of an intimate life.
My question follow-up to that then is, I don't know if you've studied statistics or anything like that when it comes to that, but I think, a lot of us, the further along we've been married, usually we're learning to be more assertive, to stand up for ourselves, to say what we think and feel, like you talked about. So as that happens, do you feel like sexual satisfaction really does increase typically, like as you get older or later in marriage?
Well, of course, it depends on the marriage and how much growth there has been. But I remember Dr. Schnarch used to say this, like, who knew that the people in their 70s are having the best sex of everybody, right? That is to say, when you start to really know each other, you're more comfortable with yourself. Women, there is research on this, start having much better sex in their 50s and so on. Of course, there's biological changes. Those things can be inconvenient and so on. But when you're bringing a big, helping of self-acceptance to that, and you're no longer feeling ashamed of your eroticism and trying to hide it and feeling apologetic and anxious, you can bring your erotic self to bed, and that's way, way, way better. And again, if sexual responsiveness were the only measure, then maybe when you're 18, it's when you're having the best sex, but that isn't a good measure. This is about how much soul you can bring and how much of your true self you can bring and how much acceptance you can bring of each other. And when you've developed more and more of that in a marriage, well, the chances are really good that you're having the best sex of your life in the second half. Mm-hmm.
I'm really excited. So you're telling me there's a lot of great things to look forward to.
Yeah, there really is, actually. So, yeah.
Again, going back, it's that thing that matters the most here is that curiosity, that compassion. And as we're having more of those, I don't even want to say difficult, but they are those difficult conversations about why is this so hard? Intimacy. What boundaries can we set up around it so it can feel safer? Like certain locations or positions or different things that don't feel so triggering. I don't have a voice. Those types of things.
Yeah, I think so. And I think what also often happens is if you are partnered in a way where you can say, this is too uncomfortable for me, or this is getting me kind of upset, even though I know that's inconvenient for you, but you're with someone who says, that's okay. Like, let's do whatever you need. Well, then the sexual self's like, okay, well, hey, okay, well, maybe I could do that. Now, I'm not saying that you necessarily can, but when you are tracking, I'm with somebody who respects my desires and feelings, I'm respecting my desires and feelings. Well, then your limbic can settle down a little bit. If you keep ignoring it, it gets louder and it gets, less interested in being sexual. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And that's when the dissociation comes in. At least it did for me. And a lot of clients talk about that. And it's so hard to enjoy sex as manifest. Actually, if you don't mind if we go there next. So it took me about 10 years to climax, to orgasm. Mm-hmm. And I was like, this is not what I thought it would be like. And I know you've spoken that before on your podcast, but what do women do, maybe that haven't heard you speak, when that is an issue for them?
Well, again, anxiety, and this is more true for women than for men. When we have a lot of anxiety, self-judgment, what's wrong with me, that's all pushing down on our arousal. And so I sometimes talk about thinking of climax as this, we've got our arousal threshold and then we have a climax threshold, and you can't control if you climax. I mean, you can control your thoughts, you can control what you do, but you can't control because it's a reflex in your body. And so when we're getting really judgmental of ourselves over something we can't control, that's not really good for us. And it's also pushing downward on our arousal level. If instead, first of all, acceptance is really important. Just being able to accept, this is where I seem to be. And can I just accept myself? There's probably good reasons. Okay. I don't have to sit around and judge myself all the time. The other thing you can do is take some of the judgment factors away. If you're having a hard time being with your spouse and you're thinking they're so bored and, oh my gosh, and maybe have your spouse not be a part of it, and then if you feel like I can't figure it out, even touching myself alone, then maybe you get a vibrator or something. So there's just ways where you can bring the anxiety level down. And then also how you talk to yourself. Some people are like, oh my gosh, I can't touch myself. That would mean that I'm a terrible person. I think if you're trying to figure something out so that you can participate more deeply in an intimate relationship, I think that's really valuable. It's also restoring an important relationship to yourself. And can I talk to myself in the way I would want my partner to talk to me? Can I offer compassion and kindness and understand if my body's resisting, there's good reasons for it. It's trying to protect me. So be nice to myself and be grateful to my limbic for doing its job. Even if it's a little too helpful sometimes, I still am grateful for looking out for me. And it needs to trust that I'm going to look out for me so it can settle down. Yeah. And so, if I'm even just talking to myself in a kind way, valuing my body, expressing gratitude towards my body, That's just so much more important in the scheme of things than whether or not you reach that threshold. Now, I'm not dismissing that that's a good part of sex and a meaningful part of an intimate life. But if we make it so important that we lose track of the more meaningful part, of the connection to ourselves, the connection to a spouse, the acceptance of ourselves, the acceptance of our bodies, the acceptance of of where we are in this journey, well, then we're working at cross purposes and working against ourselves.
You had so many amazing nuggets in there too, Jennifer. I don't think I can do them justice to recap, but I will try. Again, these common themes of that acceptance, that letting go, and also how that can take off the pressure and increase the likelihood of climaxing. But even if you don't, like not having that be the focus, but really just valuing and having gratitude. Is it for yourself or the process, the experience?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, gratitude for yourself, to your body, gratitude even to your limbic. That's maybe been a little more helpful than you wish, but still gratitude that your body and brain is looking out for you. Right. And so it's not going to let go of its job until it knows that, first of all, you appreciate it and that it knows that you're going to look out for you. Right. So yeah.
And I have to address this because it's a big one. And I have heard enough of your stuff to know what you're saying and where you're coming from. But a lot of people that maybe have not heard you are like, wait. What did she just say? And so I want to go back to that for a second. And the culture of faith-led communities, especially, very taboo to do anything without your partner. Or that might be arousing or explore your sexuality. So talk a little bit about that, if you wouldn't mind, for those that have no idea what you're talking about.
Well, yeah. So again, I work a lot with Latter-day Saint couples, and it's kind of shifted in the last, decade or so, but there's generally been a prohibition against masturbation. So then the idea that a woman would be touching herself for some women is just like, oh my gosh, that's breaking all the rules and that makes me dirty or bad. And I always talk about the fact that the meaning of what we're doing matters. Lots of terrible things happen in missionary position in a marriage. Who's touching whom or what position your body's in is not the measure of goodness, but what is it that you're actually doing and creating? And so if you need to reduce the vulnerability and the anxiety of the moment to find something within yourself, then that might mean touching yourself to learn about your body and your own sexual responsiveness without all the pressure and the judgment that you may put on yourself when your spouse is there. But again, you're not trying to escape your relationship. You're trying to actually step into it. And so the meaning of what you're doing is everything.
That is so well said. It's really hard to wrap your mind around. Like, I remember it took, like I said, 10 years, but it was when I let go of some of those cultural traditions. I don't even know if it's exactly traditions. Taboos, those expectations or those beliefs that I had, even if somebody didn't like specifically say it in that way, that idea that I got that all of those things were so bad. Toys are bad. Masturbation's really bad. Sex is bad. Like all of these things. It's so hard to rewrite that narrative in your mind and really enjoy sex. And I love how you said the meaning matters. So it's not about, oh, I just want to go pleasure myself and, not have sex with my spouse. Like I'll just do it myself. Right. But it's about, okay, how can I deepen this connection? How can I improve my sexuality?
And even accept the gift of my sexuality. That's a gift from God. Right. So even that, like I've been so afraid of it. I've been taught to reject it. I've been taught that it's not. And that's not good theology. I mean, we see our bodies as gifts. And so how do I actually accept the gift of my sexuality? Because in order to be whole and spiritually whole, I have to accept this part of my humanity, make my peace with it. And that's the way I'm going to be able to love and be loved through it.
I really appreciate you speaking to those things because right now I have 2 teenagers, and a third that's going to be going into young women soon. These are hard things to navigate, to figure out how to teach them about intimacy in a healthy way and to shift that cultural norm that maybe you've grown up with. So I really appreciate you speaking to that. And just a final quick question is anything else that you could teach us about deepening that intimacy and that fulfillment in your relationship that maybe we haven't spoken to yet?
Well, I think, I'm finishing up a book around the sexuality, the spirituality of sexuality, basically the way the two are very deeply connected, even though when we grow up early, we tend to think of them as completely different, that our sexual feelings are actually interfering with our spirituality and so on. But the way that, the soul of our sexuality resides in deepening our comfort in our own bodies and deepening our comfort with our spouse. And when we're trying to produce things or take care of needs or just get through the act, we're working against the spirituality of it. We're working against our souls. And so we have to settle into ourselves. And sometimes the most intimate thing is just having a conversation late at night, where you understand each other better, where you're maybe touching each other, but just growing into deeper understanding. That's where the soul of it resides. And good sex is building upon that emotional foundation. And when we're trying to just produce something, we're working against the authenticity that makes the sexual relationship alive and soulful and transcendent. So we can't lose sight of that authenticity that good sex needs. Again, that sexual self is looking for that. And when it's not there, it tends to hide and move away.
Oh, I love that. Again, it goes right into that common theme, that authenticity, that standing up for yourself, advocating for yourself. I hadn't even thought about it in that spiritual sense. You said you're writing that book right now?
Yeah, I keep thinking, I keep saying it's close, and I just keep refining it, but it's getting better. So I need to keep doing it. But I think it will probably be published in the next few months. So yeah, we're getting there. Mm-hmm.
I'm so excited to read that. With that, then where can we find your book when that's coming out or other things?
Sure. So Faith Matters is the publisher of the book. So that will be, but my website is my last name, which is Finlayson-Fife.com. And on there, you can see all the free and paid resources that I have, which are the Conversations with Dr. Jennifer podcast, which is free, Room for Two, which is a subscription podcast where I'm working with real couples around the issues of intimacy, both emotional and sexual, and how to improve it. And then I have 5 online courses for LDS couples specifically, but are applicable for anybody really that's a human being, but even especially people in a faith, in a faith background. But those are all about how to deepen your emotional and sexual intimacy in your partnership, but also even just with yourself to be more at peace in your own skin. So that's all there. And when the book's released, it'll be on that website too. So yeah.
I'm so glad you're a voice to talk about those things as hard subjects when so few do. Well, thank you, Jennifer, so much for coming on. It was a delight to have you on and to pick your brain a little bit. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Jennifer Finlayson-Fife as much as I did. There were some incredible things that really can be life-changing, like leaning in, being curious, being compassionate. As a reminder, you can go to fulfillment.therapist.org, where our courses will be available January 1st, 2025 for our personal growth course called Ignite Your Life, and Find Your Focus if you are wanting to start your own online business and podcast and spread those positive ripples and become your best self. Those courses will be available soon. So check it out. Also, there is a gift for Christmas, although you can't access that gift until January 1st and 2nd. And what that is you will get 25% off for 48 hours only, any of those courses. So access that gift because it is not around very long and it will take your life to the next level. Again, thank you so much for listening today. I will see you back here in just a few days. Take care, my friends. Hey friends, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, chances are someone else would too. Would you take 30 seconds to share this with a friend who's looking for greater family fulfillment? And while you're sharing, tell me what you think about the show by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts. It refuels me when I hear this podcast is helping you. No matter what your house or your hair looks like, I'll meet you back here every Monday and Thursday morning for more episodes. Until then.